And in fact, I had almost forgotten about them because it had been done so long before. So any of these things, they're a process that has taken a very long time in its development. But 2020 is the year that marks the 19th Amendment actually going into effect. It was signed and we knew it was going to happen, or it was known that it was going to happen in 1919. Then it goes into effect in 2020. Most women got the right to vote in 2020, but not all women got the right to vote. So let me say this. So it's important that we commemorate this, but we need to understand right from the very beginning that not all women got the right to vote at that time, because states are the ones who determine the actual parameters of the specific individuals that can vote. So many southern states kept Black women and men from voting. And Native American people were not allowed to vote because they weren't considered citizens. And citizenship happened in 1924 for Native Americans. But many states kept Native American people from being able to vote, women and men, until the Voting Rights Act in 1965. So it marks a partial achievement, and it's important that that's visited in 2020.
Thank you, Dr. Goodyear. Dr. Chatelain, what are your thoughts?
Well, when a film like The Vote comes out, I often think about all of the work that had to happen in order for that film to be possible. And so it's many years of funding and of research, but it also is about a shift in the ways we tell stories about the past. That if you were to watch a film that was commemorating the 90th the 90th anniversary, the 80th, the 70th, the 60th, what the filmmakers would be willing to talk about versus where the silences would exist is a reflection of kind of where we are, not only in our recognition of the way that racism and white supremacy was within this movement, an acknowledgement of it, but in a kind of measured and mature way of thinking about the complexity of people who in a previous generation would have just been marked the hero or the villain of the story. And so I think that anytime we watch these films, we have to be aware that it isn't just about more research being available or undiscovered manuscripts. It's about an ideological shift about what the uses of history are and what the potential is in telling a fuller story.
I love that. And when we talk about, I've had a lot of conversations with people about what do we hope to get out of this year. And to be honest, that is one of the things I hope we realize about this year. So really thank you for bringing that up. So I want to talk about how sexism per se and racism per se began in this country. And I know it's complicated, and if we could just quickly kind of refresh people's memories about, if we go back to our country's origins, just talk about from your point of view, where sexism and racism started and how it was a way of life for the first people who inhabited the lands where we are, and then as we developed into the country that we are today. And can you also talk some about the dynamics of the time? We'll start with you, Dr. Goodyear.
Oh, she puts me on the spot. When I think about this topic, and I do want to say it's excruciatingly complicated, as you've mentioned, this complication. In fact, racism and sexism wasn't even an ism. It wasn't even a thing. It was so what we can define today, what we can talk about today as an ism, racism and sexism, it didn't even occur to them. it was, and it's hard for us to wrap our brains around this, but it was so ingrained that it wouldn't have occurred to people to consider women people or people of color people in any capacity. So if we think about, and let's just for a bit talk about the Constitution and the founders. We celebrate these founders. They were all white men in the United States. They're all white men. Many of them were slaveholders, and many of them were married to women who it was as if they didn't exist on any level other than in a capacity to serve white men. And it's hard to wrap our brains around today, to wrap our brains around this kind of idea, but it never occurred to them. And the thing that will frustrate us when we, as John Adams, whose wife said, John, or Mr. Adams, you need to remember the ladies, which is an often repeated quotation. Remember the ladies, because otherwise they're going to have a revolution of their own if you don't weave them in. And she wasn't thinking about women of color. She was thinking about white women. So it's like, it's hard to understand it and it's hard to accept it, because for us today, this is something that we think about and deal with and talk about daily. And we're working today on so many of these issues, but it wasn't for them. It's as if they have blinders on and nothing exists outside of the service to themselves. I hope, Marcia, you can add to that and help with making that even more poignant and clear.
I think that, on one hand, we can say that we can't relate to the impulses of, the colonial era. Most of us will not stab another human being in order to take their land. But we have extensions of violence, and we have an idea of property, and we have modes of inequality that still exist today. And so I think that the question of whether we've changed and evolved so much, or are we just in a continuous cycle, is, one of the big existential questions about history. But when we think about racism and sexism, we are talking about kind of structural, intellectual, and ideological commitments to inequality that the basis are of some type of qualified difference to whatever figure we've decided is a figure of supremacy or goodness. And so when we talk about it in relationship to something like the right to vote, it's all based on not just kind of individual people's sorting mechanism for the world. It's about structures that encourage action in order to keep power where it was. And so the reason why we have these exclusions kind of within the document of the Constitution is because the nation was predicated on a kind of murderous violence and theft. And so all the documents make sure that the murderous violence and theft make sense. And, these are the clear rules. And so I think that, to talk about racism and sexism in relationship to voting, it's also about the different ways that people in power concede a little bit of power in order to reorganize themselves as more powerful in a different context.
Thank you so much for setting that up. So when did the suffrage movement really begin? And, what's the relationship with the US suffragists, with suffragists or people who were fighting for women's rights outside of the US?
Mm-hmm.
Susan?
Sure. So So it's really fun because we almost always love to have origin stories. And so the origin story that we've been told for ages and ages is that Seneca Falls, New York, on the canal, was the founding place of the women's suffrage movement in 1848. And it grew from there. One wonderful scholar, Lisa Tetrault, wrote a book called The Myth of Seneca Falls. And she talks about how many of the suffrage leaders wanted an origin story. So they essentially created that after the Civil War. And so they said, well, this is what marks the beginning of the suffrage movement. I think that the suffrage, I think it's easier to understand if we talk about it as suffrage activism, voting rights for groups other than white elite males. Those kinds of, that kind of activism began much longer, almost as soon as the Constitution and the founding of the United States and the Constitution itself was written. And so in 1821, there is expansion of suffrage rights in some of the states. There are women who advocate for their right to vote. And you can find lots of different examples in a lot of different places. But they start advocating maybe in the 1840s. But and so it's not exactly a movement. It's not, doesn't have one leader. It's almost like there are, from the ground up, maybe grassroots, this idea that there are places where this pops up. In the 1700s, in the late 1700s, women in Virginia, women in New Jersey could vote because they hadn't been not able to vote, and they had been voted, but that was taken away from them in the early, I think in 1809 or something. So there's all these different, but they're kind of, some ways they're organic, to use a word that's often used today. They rise up in different ways. There's agitation and calls for the expansion of democracy. The vote, it means democracy, and that's really what we're talking about. So that expansion, it moves like that. Although Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton would have said, by golly, it started in 1848 at Seneca Falls, period. And it's really much more complicated than that.
Excellent. Dr. Chatterwood?
You know, I think that response was beautiful. The only thing I would add is that one thing I think it's important for us to note as we think about this centennial is the various ways that women participated in civil society and the building of a democratic ideal outside of voting. Because in order for women to be able to mobilize for the right to vote, they had to have been practiced in a lot of different ways. And so I think in many ways, if we think about the road to suffrage, we have to think about the expansion of homosocial spaces for women to talk and gather. We have to think about the increasing literacy of women, their ability to understand different kind of social and political contexts so they can compare the US to Britain, to Russia, or wherever. And the other thing is the fact that a lot of these women were raised to moral action in the abolition movement. And so this is why I think there's a deep poignancy about the racism and white supremacy that emerged in some of the rhetoric of of the suffrage movement, because a lot of these women had been practiced in activism and social justice through abolition. And I think that this provides us a really great opportunity to not only learn more about the different approaches to suffrage activism, but to also think about the diversity in thought around abolition. The way that most students are taught about abolition, it was just people who were against slavery. But the real kind of dynamic lesson of that is they all had a very different vision of how slavery should end, when it should end, on what terms, and what happens to the emancipated person. And I think understanding those two movements together helps us understand why in our own present context, we find ourselves sometimes thinking, well, don't we all have the same goals? But those pathways to those goals is actually really, really important to interrogate.
I'm really glad you brought that up, because I think when people hear that, when they hear that a lot of the suffragists were abolitionists, and then when it came down to who was going to be included in that definition of suffrage, Black women were some of the first people that they decided to take out. Can you talk more about that, just why that shift occurred? And you definitely started by saying they had different definitions of abolitionism, but can you talk more about that dynamic? Either of you, both of you?
Let's have Marcia speak first.
Okay.
So what I mean by that is that just because a person opposed the institution of slavery, it didn't mean that they actually believed in Black equality. Those are actually strangely two separate issues that were on the table in the 19th century. And so if you look at the abolition movement, some people believed in abolition and repatriation to Africa. Some people believed in abolition and slavery. Some people, a radical group, believed in abolition and kind of radical interracial living and social equality, and they would even be willing to risk their position and standing to advocate for interracial marriage. That was a very small group. Some people believed that there was an opportunity in an agrarian utopian world where we could kind of deal with these issues. And there were radical abolitionists who really did believe that violence was the only way. And there were abolitionists who believed in moral suasion. All of this is to say that when you have the complexity of all of these ideas, it doesn't necessarily point into the direction that you're going to believe in racial equality. And I think that there's something about the vote that through this process of participating in this film and thinking about the centennial, the vote is different because it happens in kind of one way for all people. One person, one vote, one decision. Unlike other methods of trying to expand opportunity or break down barriers, there are all of these different ways. So when we talk about school integration, when we talk about housing desegregation, when we talk about public accommodations, these are done at different frequencies because of race and class. But voting is actually probably one of the acts that creates the most anxiety among people who don't want change, because you can't really manipulate the very act of it across any kind of color or class lines. It's one person in a ballot. And I think that's why some of the insidious and most recent attempts to discourage people from voting or obstruct voter registration is really also very powerful. But voting is one of those civil rights that everyone is doing in the same way, and you really can't mess with it. And I think this created a lot of anxiety for people who did not believe in equality among the races, even if they didn't believe there should be a system of subjugation among the races.
And I think many of those points are incredibly important to talk about, because democracy, as we define democracy means really political participation. It means having a voice in government. It means being able to make laws. There's a lot of different ways that we can participate in democracy. And this, I think, Marcia alluded to earlier on when she said that people did this in a number of different ways. And so some of the examples of that would be, and I'm sure we'll bring this up again a little bit later, but participation in a democracy can be writing a petition. and getting signatures on that petition in order to make some changes. Now, women and men had been using this technique of democracy in the abolition movement and from then on. Other ways that people participated besides voting, other ways would be in demonstrations, which is one of the things that you see in the film, The Vote, is women who stood before the White House and said, we want the right to vote. Well, they didn't say it. They stood there with signs that said that. So the ability to picket, those kinds of things are participatory, but those are uneven. And the vote is in many ways the great equalizer, and or should be. We can talk about some of the problems with the vote that have to do more with the Electoral College than it does with the one person, one vote kind of thing, or the problems that come in when people don't have access to the voting polls and things like that. But the point that I think is really important to understand about this is that the vote became a symbol, and many scholars point to Susan B. Anthony, who's one of the most recognizable names of the suffrage movement. They point to her and they say, well, she's the one who said the vote will lead us to the other areas where we need to do work. It will increase our access to politics. It will give us better laws for working class people. It will help feed children, and it will do all of these things. So the vote was not only seen as this essential piece of democracy, but the key to all these other changes. So when the women's, if we think about it, the women's suffrage movement started, it really started as a women's rights movement, and it was much broader and covered many, many, many more areas than the vote. And the closer we got to 1900, the more it became, it's the vote, the vote, the vote, and that will be the ticket for later, for all these other things that we need.
Excellent, excellent. So when we're having these discussions today, and you all have done a great job of setting up, you know, how at the time sexism and racism aren't seen the same way they are today. But I hear a lot of people saying we're talking about the racism of the suffrage movement, but we're not talking about the sexism of the suffrage movement as much. What do you have to say to that?
So to kind of clarify, so when you ask about the sexism of the movement, do you mean the sexism that was apparent that caused the movement to respond, or do you mean sexism within the movement itself?
I think they're talking about,
do you know what I'm asking you?
I think they're talking about within the movement. Or just the pure fact that,
so that's,
go ahead.
No, you say what you were saying.
I was just going to say,
I missed part of what you were saying.
I think what they're saying, maybe I'm putting words in their mouth, is the pure fact that the misogyny, how at one point, you know, Black men, they just got the right to vote technically, you know, on paper, but not in practice, but women didn't. I don't.
Just so what you essentially are asking is how does sexism have an impact on the movement, whether it's from within or without, and some of the ways that that happens.
Yeah.
Okay, good. Okay, so that's really an interesting question, because to me, one of the most crucial points of shift in a movement that we call either the women's rights movement or the women's suffrage movement does come in the years right after the Civil War, a period where there's new Reconstruction amendments being added. So the period from 1865 to 1870, so the 13th Amendment, which officially abolishes slavery, the 14th Amendment, which makes former enslaved people citizens, but adds a four-letter word that we had many, many years of trouble getting out. That word was male, which wasn't in the Constitution before, right? And then the 15th Amendment, which said citizens can vote, but they are now understood because of the 14th Amendment to be male. One of the arguments that people have made a number of times is that during the Civil War, African American men fought, and there were hundreds, thousands of Black men who fought during the war. And they're most often in segregated, in segregated groups with white men as their leaders. Now, most women didn't fight in the war. We know we have examples of 400 women who fought North and South, but they were disguised as men. So we can almost leave them. We didn't know they were women, most of them. As far as I know, there was one Black woman who also disguised herself as a man. So what we see is this idea of soldiering as being quintessentially male. So there's one thing. The other piece, so then what does it have to do with women and leaving women out of this story? Well, in the 19th century especially, and during this period, so 1820s, 1830s, 40s, 50s, and so on, when women spoke in groups where it was men and women, they were considered promiscuous. A promiscuous audience is one that is made up of both sexes. What's interesting about that is that during the war, there were women who served as women, as nurses, as supporters, working, taking care of the farms and the businesses and so on. But women who left their homes and went to work as anything but a stay-at-home mom and wife were promiscuous. And so instead of it making women appear to be more capable, there was that feeling that you needed to get these women to go back home and behave themselves and be wives and mothers and nothing else. And of course, that's not totally true, but that's a perception. And one of the reasons why soldiering and masculinity got very, very closely linked. Women were not, nobody thought that women could fight, even though they actually had examples of it. And that's another interesting story. But the point being is that soldier citizen became a thing, an important thing.
Dr. Chatelain, do you have anything to add?
No, I think that analysis of military service as the pivot in which one gains their rights, you will see that strategy throughout the civil rights struggle. Mm-hmm. So whether it's serving in the Civil War as a soldier and then expecting protections during Reconstruction and then having that taken back, and then African-American men and to some extent women in service during the World Wars and the Vietnam War, as well as the Korean War, as the basis of signaling from the 19th century context as devotion to country or patriotism, to seeing access to the vote as something that is compensatory or just because of sacrifice. It's a really, really powerful formulation. And that's why when we get to the 40s, 50s, and 60s, so many African American men wear their soldiers' uniforms when they go out to march or they go to pray during demonstrations, because they want to show that that deep hypocrisy of not letting the soldier or the patriot vote.
Fascinating. Excellent explanation. Go ahead.
So I was going to add to that. One of the things that I think that Marcia is pointing to, and that I'm sure that a lot of people are seeing, is that a lot of these issues that we raise up, whether it's uniforms or it's the vote, a lot of these things are shorthand for other things. They're symbolic or they're significant because they mean a certain thing to a population at a particular time. And Marcia mentioned this before. If we did this 10 years ago or 20 years ago, the stories would have been very different. I think that it's like a lot of us, a lot of people don't go deeper down into it to understand it, or to really do the analysis that goes that complication. But these things, wearing a uniform, having a female body, those kinds of things were symbolic of something that we don't necessarily recognize in the same way today. So you have to pay sometimes very, very close attention when you're doing this kind of history to look at these things from a lot of different perspectives. What did it mean? And how did that affect the people who viewed that thing, or that indicator, or that garment, or that whatever it was that expressed something. So soldiers would be seen a certain way, and they were often expressing something maybe differently than what viewers would have seen. So some men, African American men who wore uniforms, would put themselves at physical risk for the violence that we were talking about earlier, in some of the comments that Marcia had made.
Well, do you know much in terms of the strategy of the suffrage movement? How much of it was included trying to be, for lack of a better way of saying it, less of a woman? Or how much of it was they were insistent upon being who they were as women and continue to fight for the larger rights you were saying, and the vote being a vehicle to get there? And then how much of it was them trying to, I don't want to say seem more male, but you know what I'm saying? Like not be seen as the female, which made them not equal to men.
Mm-hmm. Do you want to take this to begin, Marcia?
Yeah, so I think what you're getting at is these ideas of public perception of kind of women and their place. And I think that there was a great deal of strategic thinking about what it meant for women to be engaged in this kind of activism. When we see the women who are essentially arrested and put at the workhouse and are force-fed, this is a way of thinking about the dichotomy between the kind of benevolent sexism that says that women are supposed to, or white women are supposed to be kind of nurtured and comforted, and then the state deploying violence against women protesters. So there was a lot of ways in which the suffrage movement was really playing with ideas of gender and of separate spheres for women. And I think what's also interesting when we look at the different ways that women are making cases for the right to participate, sometimes they do it based on ideas of maternalism, that, you know, that a woman has a special role to take care of society. She takes care of society by voting. Or the idea of, you know, Republican motherhood, this idea that, you know, women are integral to the kind of raising up of the nation. But one of the things that I think is really fascinating is that you still see this today in the ways that women present themselves when they run for public office. I always think it's so ridiculous. when women who have spent a lot of time galvanizing political power have to say, I'm a mom first. It's like, is that interesting to the kind of conception of who this person is? And it also, on one hand, is done to try to stabilize the figure in the press. I think it's fascinating that we have a woman running for vice president who is a stepmom who got married, I believe, in her late 40s, if not at 50 years old. And to think about the ways that that narrative, if she were running against a different type of candidate, but that's for another conversation. I'm curious the ways that she would have to kind of bring a family kind of angle to her narrative, because I think that this becomes part of the template for how women are supposed to make other people feel comfortable when they want power. So I think for the suffrage movement, there was a lot of thinking about the representational strategies of the way women dressed, the way they appeared in public, what they looked like when they were arrested, and then a larger narrative about making sure that men were not threatened by the fact that women may possibly vote.
So I love that. You remind me of one of the women who was from Long Island. Her name was Edna Buckman Kearns, and she was working for the suffrage movement. She did a lot of work for the suffrage movement, and she had come in to give a speech, and I guess she must have run in and been a little bit, her hair might have been a little bit messy or something. Well, she had just come from canning so many jars of peas and making so many jars of jelly or something like that. And so she's saying, oh, well, I canned my peas and I did this, and everybody wanted her recipes. And then the newspaper article that mentions their peas, and she had
Okay, we're having some trouble with Susan's audio. She mentioned that she might go.
Serena, and took her daughter Serena, and her was the youngest girl, who picketed at the White House. So she was there as one of the picketers, and not a lot of people know about her. But that good mother, domestic, very feminine. But the other, which is, so it's fun. But the other thing I wanted to mention is that anti-suffragists, women who organized to oppose women getting the right to vote, and other men who were opposed, were very often depicted in their cartoons, in their speeches, in their rhetoric, that suffragists were manly. So you see, there are hundreds of political cartoons that have the iconic suffragist, and she's wearing pants, which would have been horrifying to people at the time. And she would be, or you'll see a picture of a man holding the baby, trembling, while his harridan of a wife is holding a stick over him and telling him he's got to do the dishes or something like this. This horrified people, just horrified them. And so it's interesting to see how there are many ways that, so anti-suffragists, men who opposed women getting the right to vote, women who were uncomfortable with the activism of suffragists, tried very hard to depict these activists that were demanding more rights as something unfemale or not acceptable, that they were socially deviant. And one more point I want to make this is also, when we get to the turn of the century, there was this guy, his name was Havelock Ellis, and he looked at sexuality and he argued, but suffragists were sexual inverts and kind of implied that many of
Okay.
Susan was
these women, many of these.
Okay.
Anyway, sorry.
No, it's okay. It's okay. So what about racism? And I know that's a conversation we're having more this year, but from your perspectives, what role did racism play in the suffrage movement?
Or I'm going to let Marcia start with that.
Well, I think that racism was the dominant structuring frame of the United States, past and present. And so in terms of the suffrage movement, the capacity for members of the suffrage movement to see their work on behalf of all women, for some was very limited. For others, they understood the importance of Black women getting the vote. So there was a mix. But the way that racism played out was that this was a political campaign at its very heart, and it was strategic. And one of the ways you see race informing strategy was the idea from Northern and Northeastern suffrage movement supporters wondering if bringing Black women into their struggle would alienate white women from the South. And you see this contention about Southern white women in a number of struggles, not just suffrage, in prohibition movements. You see this in issues around the consolidation of women's clubs, of the YWCA. You see it in the struggle to change age of consent laws for sexual activity. There are a number of these movements that women are very concerned about. And you see that some women, even if they don't necessarily buy into all white supremacist ideas and they're not necessarily eugenicists, they are concerned that the presence of Black women as equals in their movement will alienate women in the South. And you also have to take in consideration that for some of the women who were in their 50s and 60s, they had lived through the Civil War at the turn of the 20th century, and they were very aware of the kind of factionalism that existed around slavery and race. And so they were being both racist and politically expedient in their own framework by keeping the issue of Black women voting out. But I think there's another element of this that is important to note, that starting with the founding of the National Association of Colored Women in 1896, people throughout the country saw what happened when Black women organized, that they had created this massive movement of women who were both, who were mostly middle class, but had definitely done a lot of work to rebuild portions of the South that had been left behind in Reconstruction, as well as create Black communities in northern and western and eastern cities where Blacks had migrated. And so they knew the kind of political work Black women were capable of doing. And they knew that if Black women got the vote, they were going to exercise it and they were going to take it very seriously. And this was actually something that in an excellent book by Kimberly Hamlin, Free Thinker, that looks at Helen Hamilton Gardner, she talks about a member of Congress from the South writing in a letter, like, if the Black women get votes, they will use them. And so I think that we can't discount the racism that structured these women's lives. We can't deny the fact that in the early 20th century, ideas of racial superiority that were scientific very much shaped the intellectual life of cultural and social and political elites. And we also can't forget the way that race is often a lever in various directions in political movements, and the suffrage movement is one of those many political movements in the United States where some of the calculations around racial solidarity were made, and people proceeded with that idea in their head.
Dr. Goodyear?
I think that what Marcia has said is is excellent and on point. I would like to say a couple of things. One is that the more you study a topic, the more you find people who don't fit the the mainstream movements, mainstream ideas, or the mainstream thoughts about something. So one of the stories that I did quite a bit of research on, and I was quite interested in, was in New York State. There was one of the organizations that existed, Elva Vanderbilt Belmont. She was a very, very, very wealthy person. So she gets married to this super rich man, and then she divorces him, and she marries another super rich man, and she had like 15 houses or something like that. Super, super rich. Now she decided that she would go to the African American community, and she would make a branch of her political equality association. She would get these African American women to form a branch of her organization. So and I see her sailing into this meeting. She knew a couple of the African American women leaders. One in particular was Sarah Garnett, who was a teacher who had actually founded an African American, it was the Brooklyn Colored Women's Suffrage Organization, and another woman. And this Alva Belmont comes in and says, "Oh, you should have a branch of my organization." Well, these women, and yes, they were middle class women, these women had already been doing this since in the 1880s. And here Alva Belmont comes in 1910. They had already been doing their political activism. They had already been meeting and having debates and listening to speeches and advocating and being written up in the newspapers and so on and so forth. And so many of these women said, well, we'll give money to the organizations, but we're not going to create a branch of her organization. We're already doing that. And of course, Alva Belmont.
Okay, sorry. Yeah, she mentioned that she would have some issues. Um, okay, I think she's frozen.
That come in, and that complicates things.
So Susan, unfortunately, we missed some of what you said because of the internet, but that's fine. That's fine. As we start to wrap up, just a couple more questions. So, what do you both think that the suffragists would say about political life in 2020?
That's a good one. I think that they would be surprised.
I think they would be somewhat disappointed. I think suffragists. Go ahead.
Oh, I think they would. I think they would be surprised by the low quality of character of the president. I think they would be kind of confused as to the nature of his disposition toward it. And I think that what they would also be surprised is that probably in their vision of getting the vote, they thought that by 2020, everything would probably be 50%, 50%. I think they would be really surprised by how so few women are still in elective office.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Susan, what do you think? Oh, she's frozen again. Okay. I'm gonna give her just a sec. Okay, she's still pretty frozen. Okay, so the next question. Oh, go ahead. Go ahead.
I just that they would have been disappointed,
Okay.
and for many of the reasons that Marcia claimed or said already, I think they would have been disappointed. I think they would have thought the same, 50%.
Right, right.
Yeah.
So as we wrap up, what's next? I mean, where do you see the fight for voting rights in the next 10 years? And in your opinion, I know you're historians and well, you cover a lot of areas, but you're definitely historians and scholars. What will it take for us to get to parity?
This is unfortunate. This is a terrible, terrible take, but I think it's true. I think that we will see more women in political office. The more and more we see women who are either independently wealthy and can finance their own campaigns, or women who run on platforms that are entirely acquiescence to corporate interests. And I hate to say that.
Hmm. Interesting.
And but I think that what I would like to say, and I do apologize if it's my internet that's giving us trouble. But what I'd like to say is that we have a lot of work to do. And I think conversations like this are critical. I think there are more and more people change this. It needs to stop the racism, the sexism, the violence, all of these things. I think there are many, many, many people who suffer with this to the point where they want it to end. We do have a big group that doesn't want it to end, but we do have people who really sincerely want it to end.
Excellent. Do either of you have any closing thoughts or remarks?
We're all at home and it's terrible, and we're all struggling right now. But if we can commit ourselves to learning a little bit more history, if we have a little time to do so, I think it'll remind us that the fight against inequality is long. It takes a while, but it allows us to learn better and better strategies to make a difference for tomorrow.
Excellent. Susan?
Mm-hmm. Beautifully said. Beautifully said. I think I have to say how much I agree, and I will take that away. I remember that when I was an undergrad, there was this very, very angry student. He was a student. And he said, the only way that things are going to change is with blood. And he was very, very angry. And I was very frightened. I'm afraid of violence, like most people. And I tried to be brave, and I said, I think you're wrong. It starts with us and our children and the people we're with. We need to be the change we need to see in the world. We need it. And I'm not the first person who said that, but it reminds me of that when I think about this time. It's not letting the status quo continue. It's these demonstrations that we're seeing, to me, tells us that there are many, many, many people, white and non, and people of color, and all kinds of people, old, young, in the middle, who say, no, this is not acceptable, and we need to make these changes. But they start with us. They start with us. So keep the conversations going.
Excellent. Thank you. And I think if we think about, Susan B. Anthony, who fought so hard and unfortunately did not get to see the fruits of her labor, sometimes that's just the way it is. So we're fighting for our legacy. We're fighting for our future. So thank you both, Susan Goodyear, Dr. Marcia Chatelain, for this conversation. It's been really eye-opening, really reflective on history. And you're right. We need to keep having these conversations in order to do better in the future. So thank you so much and have a great evening.
Thank you. Thank you.